Viewers, today I have a new guest joining us on our Hangout. The person that you're going to meet today is he wears many hats. He is a communication strategist, a political analyst, change strategist, speaker, writer, consultant, and businessman. He is a lover of Kenya and Africa, very keen on innovations, discussions, and solutions that would bring about a change in the world. Mark Bichachi, welcome to PGurus channel.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Mark, today we're going to talk a little bit about your neck of the woods. So, viewers, I'll just give you a brief intro on what we're going to talk about today. We have talked in the past about China's strategy to try and contain India. You know, they have that CPAC project in Pakistan. They have the Hambantota port investment in Sri Lanka. They tried to meddle with Maldives elections. So we know that China, and now, of course, you are hearing all the things that are going on in Nepal. Now, here we are going to turn the spotlight on what China has been doing in Kenya. And to know more about it, let's go out to Mark. Mark, my first question to you
Yes.
is, can you please provide us a summary of Chinese engagement in Kenya?
Okay, so the Chinese are involved in a number of projects in Kenya, mainly infrastructure projects. So you've got the train project, the SGR standard gauge railway project, all the way from Mombasa, terminating in Naivasha. And then you've got all the major highways, the bypasses around the city of Nairobi. These are done by China Road and Bridge Company, as well as China Wuyi. Of course, funded by loans from China to the Kenyan government. And then you've got private interests and private commercial buildings being built across the city by Chinese nationals. You've got a few manufacturing plants being run by Chinese nationals. Then you've got the small retail shops that are also run by Chinese nationals. So the Chinese investment in Kenya, both as a government and also for Chinese individuals, is quite large in the country.
Now, the SGR, the single gauge rail, the reigning wisdom when it was started was that it would provide a connect for Kenya to get all its goods, and not only that, to also enable the neighboring countries such as Uganda also to have access to the port, isn't it? So where did things go wrong? I read recently that the Supreme Court of Kenya struck down this whole deal. And so where did it all go wrong? What was the vision to start with?
Well, the vision to start with, you're quite right, was to reinvigorate the rail network in Kenya. As probably you know, we had a railway that was built under colonialism in the early 1900s, and that had been allowed to go to disrepair simply because the previous regime of President Moi from 1978 to 2002 decided to do business with the transport, and therefore the president having investment in the trucking industry allowed the train industry to fall so that a lot more trucks could be used. Now, during President Kibaki's term, the idea was muted to create a standard gauge railway that would not only allow for faster trains, but would also allow for larger amounts of goods to be transported at a time. Now, of course, up to there, the logic makes sense, and that's what the country was supposed to do. But two things happened, as often happens with this kind of projects. Number one is the long hand of corruption that we've become all too familiar in our neck of the woods.
Yes.
And the cost of the project went from 100 billion Kenya shillings, that's about $1 billion, to 350 billion Kenya shillings, which is 3.5 billion. There was also the issue of where the train is going to go through. They have a lot of services across a lot of court battles there. There was issues with how much we were paying landowners for displacing them to build the railway, and there was a lot of corruption there. So that's one side of the thing. But the other side is the contract between the Kenya government and the Chinese government as concerns the loan was kept away from the public for a long time. And it's interesting you bring up the case because the case was determined off of a leaked contract. So
I
it's not
see.
like the government presented the actual contract in court. And that's the other part, the willingness of the Chinese government to bend the rules to accommodate certain malpractices. And this is one project that we know for sure had malpractices.
Well, viewers, you're going to see this term come again and again, and I'm going to repeat it today. BGY, blue, gold, and yellow. This is a strategy that China has adopted across the world to try and control the people who are in power in various countries. And I'm seeing that a similar thing is playing itself out in Kenya too. So to get back to one thing that you mentioned in your opening remarks, Mark, you said that there are a lot of Chinese stores, Chinese buildings, Chinese structures coming up. Do they employ the locals for all these constructions, or are they bringing them in from China?
Well, that's it's a mixed bag. It depends on company to company and project to project. Let me take the SGR for example. The SGR
Yes.
has been mad with issues of people complaining that the Chinese had basically made it a Chinese railway. In fact, I personally complained about a tunnel that was labeled fully in Chinese, and the argument was, why would you label a Kenyan tunnel in Chinese? Because it's not a grant, it is a loan we've taken and we are paying for, so we technically own it. The signs on the SGR, there was a lot of Chinese imprints and there was a lot of complaints. And now that brings me to your question in terms of labor. So it's a mixed bag, because by Kenyan law, you need to employ a certain amount of locals. But what happened is the Chinese, quite more often than not, have had more people than they should coming from China to do jobs that and by Kenyan law you are supposed to only hire expatriates who can do jobs that a local Kenyan can't do. So you have them flaunting quite a bit of those rules, but also on a HR perspective, there's been complaints of employee mistreatment of the locals, harassment, racism, and underpayment. So there have been a lot of complaints across various companies that employ Africans.
What you are describing is par for the course, because I have done stories in the past where similar experience has been felt along the CPAC project that is winding its way through Pakistan. And there is an interesting story there. In Gilgit, the Chinese have built an enclave of about 100,000 people that can reside 100,000 people. And inside this walled city, everything is Chinese. All the signs, the people who live there are all Chinese. The locals are only brought in to buy vegetables or be guides or be the ones who can carry some heavy weight where the Chinese perhaps don't think they're strong enough to do it. So essentially, all this CPEC development in Gilgit area has been, consumed by the Chinese for the Chinese. This is something that Pakistan is also not happy about. And we've also seen instances where there have been incidents of violence against, on both sides, the Chinese attacking the locals and the locals attacking Chinese in cities like Karachi and Gwadar. This is the other port that they are building. Now, I have a slightly more, perhaps a difficult question for you, Mark. Do you see the Mombasa port going the way of Hambantota port? And by that, what I mean is this. When Sri Lanka realized that they could not pay...
No. Go ahead. It's an interesting... I want to listen to the Sri Lanka story. Go ahead.
Yeah, so basically now China owns Hambantota for all practical purposes. They have a 99-year lease, and when they signed the lease, they said, well, we will keep it only civilian Chinese. Yet the locals who look at these civilian Chinese say they all have a very military bearing. So
Mm.
the point I'm trying to make here is that this is a colony that is coming up in Sri Lanka. How do you view the developments in Mombasa? Do you think that a similar thing could happen in Mombasa also?
Well, I would like to hope not, but I am a realist, and I have to say that the truth of the matter is there have been a lot of rumors in and reports in our local dailies and media stating how that the port of Mombasa was part of the SGR deal with the Chinese, and given the fact that we do owe them quite a chunk of change, that if we do default, then the port will be leased out to the Chinese for a certain amount of time. Now, that is what the I don't call it the rumor mill because it has been reported in official media, but there's some truth with that because we've got a similar case in Zambia, we've got a similar case in Sri Lanka. Thankfully, Kenya has not defaulted on its loan repayments, but also the people are quite active in terms of protecting our national assets. It would be very hard in Kenya for them to do that without causing some form of civil disobedience or civil strife among the people, because I can tell you, I know my countrymen, we're not going to take it lying down. But on top of that, we've got the court ruling that declared that particular contract illegal. So it would be very hard to enforce it locally because the political and the social goodwill does not exist for such a venture. But it is rumored that the port of Mombasa is part of the collateral that we signed on when we took the SGR loan.
So, I have the next question comes about. You said that the Kenya is repaying its payments. Does the SGR has it been economically beneficial to Kenya?
Well, of course not. As you well know, such large infrastructure projects, even at the best of times, take a while to become economically
Yes.
viable. But in the case of Kenya, it has been a big success in terms of commuter transportation. But you know, the money does not come from commuters, the money comes from the actual transportation of goods. But unfortunately, they've not gotten the price point right. So a lot of the people who export out of Kenya are saying it's too expensive to get their goods onto the SGR. The flower industry says that it's the logistics are too difficult to just get their flowers onto the SGR. And then, of course, there's the logistics at the dry docks inland, and so that has not taken off. And then politically, you've got the city of Mombasa, which traditionally depends on trucking and the traditional way of moving goods, and therefore it's a political hot potato to try and push all of these goods onto the SGR. So it's not working. The government tried to create a law that would force people to move their goods on the SGR. The court struck that down. So in terms of how we are able to pay back the loan, it is, I can tell you for sure, it is not from the monies we collect from the SGR.
Well, that's that's a challenge when that happens. Do you think a change in political dispensation in Kenya can bring about a change in the relationship with China, or is it a sovereign agreement that no government can get out of?
No, it's our relationship with China is very fast and loose. It's not something that the politicians are emotionally or legally tied to. It's not that hard and fast. But again, for Kenya, the question would be who would help us build what we need to build. That's been the big question. And of course, maybe you know this, Kenya is involved in a free trade agreement negotiation with the United States. We launched that 2 days ago, and no, 3 days ago, and that's something that we are looking to, because one of the things that the population has is, one, the population has very low trust for the Chinese people and very low appetite for more Chinese debt. And therefore we've seen a lot more large contracts going to companies in the United States. So there's that, but it depends. It's, for us, there's no, I don't think we feel either way in terms of, for us, whoever gives us what we need as a country is who we're willing to talk to. We talk to the United States and Europe just as much as we talk to the Chinese. It's the only problem that you will say exists is the problems that I've talked about, how the Chinese treat our locals, the kind of loans they give us, and the kind of deals they do.
So, in terms of Kenya's business export-import relationships with United States, is Kenya a net exporter to the US or a net importer?
Well, we are a net importer to the United States. It's not as bad. In fact, if we were to talk about export-import, China has a bigger imbalance to Kenya, as in, I think it's something 97% to 3% or something like that. But you only export 3% to China, while 97% comes to Kenya. That's been a bigger challenge. The United States and Europe remain major trading partners for coffee and tea and things like that. China, on the other hand, takes very little from Kenya. So, and then our special economic zones, which I've mentioned before, have huge markets in the United States under AGOA, and that has been set to grow over the years. So in terms of trading partners, Europe and America are closer to us than the Chinese.
Now, if see, there is a theory going around saying that China is almost always on the lookout for more dollars because they are
Yes.
so starved of it that they started this initiative called the BRI, Border Roads
Yes.
Initiative. So that whole initiative was for China to provide some infrastructure and in return collect from all the countries that will be that the BRI will be passing through, and they usually collect it in terms of dollars, because
Yes.
if you look at China's trade, 99% of its trade with other countries is done in US dollars.
Mhm.
Nobody takes their RMB. They've been doing everything possible to try and make the world accept their RMB. Nobody accepts it.
Yeah.
So their counter to that was to try and do BRI and try to
Yes.
take out. That's why I asked you the question that if Kenya has dollars coming in and going out, most
Mhm.
likely China would like to get their hands at it because they are so starved right now. And with the new
Yeah.
thing happening in Hong Kong, God only knows where it's going to go. It could get escalated very fast, and we will have to wait and see how that plays out. But I have a slightly different question now. How
Yes.
do Kenyans see the Chinese aggression against India that happened last month?
Well, Kenya is a funny country. We are very self-obsessed. We have our own problems and international problems. Rarely, I think our international news on a regular broadcast is 5 minutes out of 45. So it is an intellectual question you ask, more for people like me who are interested in geopolitics and things like that. And I'm glad you mentioned Hong Kong and things like that. Now, I'll give you my view. I'll not give you the Kenyan view because we don't have one as a people. My view is this, that I think China is torn between its previous imperial expansionist roots and the modern economic expansionist ideals, and I think they're mixing up the two. I'll tell you why. If you look at how they treat Tibet, how they treat Nepal, and how they've even treated some ethnic minorities within the borders of China, and we've had the the concentration camps and things like that. I think China is slowly pivoting from its economic expansion ideology to just basic China expansion, both in terms of physical territory and in terms of actually expanding just where it's based out of. And that shift, of course, is married with the President Xi when he became president. And you can see a very big shift, and that's where the BRI initiative comes from. You can see a shift in international policy, and China is becoming a bit more aggressive, I would say, in terms of what it wants to take out of the world. You look at the South China Sea, you look at all these countries that I've mentioned, you notice that the Chinese are expanding, and they can't even wait for the deal they had for reviewing. I think it was in 2035 when they were supposed to review the Hong Kong special status. They've already passed a law to change that. And if you look at their confrontation with India concerning the disputed border, that tells you that the Chinese are shifting from being economic expansionists to actually being expansionists for the sake of being expansionists.
Do you see the same thing play out in other countries in sub-Saharan Africa?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. The amount of Chinesephobia in a lot of the population, and I'll mention just two countries that I've worked in Namibia and in Ghana, for example, is huge. The fear of them taking too many contracts to build roads, for them coming in and doing the jobs that the locals can do. There's a very big fear. And I'll give you a contractor's view of what happened. I will not tell you where, because I need to protect myself, but in one of the countries I've mentioned, that the number of local contractors that have shut down because of local road contracts going to the Chinese is about 73%.
Wow.
Okay? So that's a huge economic impact on a developing country that needs to keep a lot of its infrastructure costs need to remain local so that you're able to give jobs and things like that and incentivize your local economy. So it's a similar thing in Kenya. A lot of people who used to build roads on a large scale have shut down simply because you cannot compete with the Chinese, and the Chinese government is willing to subsidize the Chinese companies when they enter into a market so that they're able to build roads cheaper than the actual cost. So they build a road at a loss, but they do that so that the local contractors can run out of business, and then the next time they do a tender, then the Chinese can charge whatever it is they want. But I didn't tell you that.
Mark, here's the problem that I see. I just mentioned to you about the thirst for dollars for China. So what happens when they do something like this is they don't want any foreign currency being spent for paying for the local work. So what they do is, most likely, whoever is working on these projects in these countries, they are getting paid in the local currency, RMB.
Yes.
See, there's a small problem with that, in that they are telling, look, why do you care whether you're getting paid in the local currency or in RMB? Your family gets the money in RMB. But if you look at the amount of RMB that China prints as in comparison with its GDP, right? So that number is between 200 to 300%. And that is assuming that China is a $13 trillion economy.
Yes.
There's one problem with that assumption. What is that problem? It is that China's currency is not fully convertible. What that means is that if the RMB were to float in the market today, many financial analysts are saying that it will drop by 100% minimum. Assume 100% minimum, which means a $13 trillion economy suddenly comes down to $6.5 trillion economy.
Yeah.
And so the inflation is going to go through the roof inside China. And the problem would be, then they would be in the state of what I would call as a hyperinflation, because they would have printed notes which are 600% the size of the economy. So I feel that the economic earthquake that is headed towards China is going to bring it to its knees. And I think I would only advise all those poor contractors who are suffering to just somehow keep their heads above water. This thing is going to change 1 or 2 years. I guarantee you it's going to change. These are all big economic shifts. And when the change happens, it happens for good. It's not going to go back the other way. And certainly China did not do itself any favors by passing that law in Hong Kong. In my opinion, that is the last straw on the camel's back. So let's wait and see. My gut feeling is that this being a presidential year, Trump needs to take a rabbit out of his hat. He needs to. Otherwise, he's not going to come back to power. And that is not looked at very positively. If you look at the history of all US presidents, they always say, when you are running for re-election, it is your election to lose. So Trump would not want to see himself as a loser. So we have to wait and see how this plays out. But things have reached the tipping point. And I only say that, just hang in there literally and figuratively, and things will improve. And Mark, it has been a wonderful conversation that I had with you. And I hope that the viewers get a view of what China has been up to in the past so many decades. And I mean, as much as you blame the Kenyans for being self-centered, it's true of most countries. Every country has its own share of concerns, problems. They're all looking like, what do I do today? What do I, this has become the norm more than the exception. But this COVID has forced everybody to stay at home, reflect, take stock of what their future is, what their life is about. And I hope that this conversation that we've had today opens people's eyes to things that are happening outside of their sphere of interest. And Mark, I hope that we'll have a follow-up conversation in a very, very near future. And hopefully we can make that one a live hangout so that we can take questions from our viewers. Thank you very much for taking the time out to meet with us. We had a few technical difficulties. I hope the viewers will see past that, because there's some excellent information that Mark has shared with us. Thank you once again, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.